Our next session is a co-presentation titled The Do's and Don'ts of ICVFX. Here to present it from Pixamundo, we have executive producer Paolo Tamburino and virtual production and VFX supervisor Nathaniel LaRouche.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. And we just kick off with a couple of visuals. Let's go. So we're from Pixamundo, which is an Oscar, Emmy, and BS winning visual production, visualization, and visual effects company. We help to enable filmmakers to make creative decisions, basically to carry through them like an entire film or TV or commercial production at an early stage. And in particular with visual effects and B-stage visual production, we have stages in North America and Europe to help enrich the experience of creating through the integration of artists and tools, which links visualization to visual production, shoot to visual effects. To summarize, basically what we do is like we support the work of directors, DOPs, production designers, and visual effects supervisors to improve their creative process and respond with agilities to our clients for a seamless production. And that said, I'm handing over to my colleague to introduce him quickly himself, Nathaniel LaRouche.
Hi, I'm Nathaniel LaRouche. I'm a visual effects supervisor for about 14, coming on 15 years now, and just started to transition over to virtual production for the past 3 years, working primarily in the Star Trek franchise. So I think we're going to be discussing, at least starting the discussion on how to actually target what the best type of material is to actually shoot on a volume like this, like what types of things when you're reading a script, or if you're planning ahead early enough as you're writing, what types of things that you should look out for when you're actually creating content to be shot on these types of volumes. So we can dive into that right after Paulo's intro, which I think you just introed yourself, right?
Yeah,
there you are.
So I am Paolo Tamburino. I'm one of the executive producers at Pixamundo and also a trusted advisor for new production methodologies and emerging technologies. And I work together with Nathan primarily on the Star Trek franchise, along a couple of other projects which hasn't been released yet. And trying to help the company as well as the community, including you who are joining us today, to understand when and how virtual production can be useful. And as we all know, virtual production is quite a broad term. And in today's session, we're focusing primarily on in-camera visual effects, which leads me to our actual session. We're very delighted to have you here and being part of this wonderful event. And what we would like to do is kind of like share our experiences in how to apply successfully in-camera visual effects, also known as ICVFX, but also present you scenarios, what might lead you to failure. And the crucial question you should ask yourself is basically, why do you want to use in-camera visual effects in the first place? We strongly believe after those years of experience and working on high-profile shows that you want to consider using in-camera visual effects primarily if it helps to increase the scope of the world you're trying to build. And that said, let's begin with the first part of our talk, which is demonstrating various great and less applicable use cases. And that said, I'm handing over back to Nathan.
Great. So I think like the first obvious space that really lends itself well to shooting on volumes this large is really large, expansive environments, and not trying to design closed-in spaces that fit the actual dimensions of the wall you're shooting on, and trying to make it feel like every single time you start cutting together a sequence, or you're watching a sequence that's shot on one of these volumes, that you're taking advantage of the tech and the world just feels like super massive and expansive. Because then you tend to mix it between shooting in practical locations, which in that scenario they can be more closed off, they can be smaller, contained, they can be sets that are on a sound stage like a hallway or someone's room, something like that. And then whenever you're designing an environment for an actual LED wall shoot, take advantage of it, make it huge, make it expansive, and make it something that's inspirational, to like an inspiring backdrop, and something that just elevates the whole production value of the show. What you're seeing here is a Starbase environment that we built for season 1 of Trek, and we came back to it multiple times. It was a crowd favorite. Probably the second really good use case scenario is just making an actual shoot more efficient. So in this sequence in particular, we're in a Vulcan restaurant, and the whole sequence takes place at sunset. So you're able to pause, a very beautiful looking lighting scenario at a particular moment, and then shoot a long scene of dialogue, which simplifies the shooting process, not having to essentially chase the sun, and possibly even having to shoot over multiple days to try to get that sun in one position. In this case, it's a very sci-fi looking backdrop, but the same methodology could be applied to a very normal looking backdrop as well. Another similar way to simplify shoots, and that we've done a couple of times, we just can't show it right now because it's for a season that hasn't been aired yet, but it's for driving plates. So just being able to go out, shoot footage, and then play it back on these walls, bring in the car, and do all of your interior, like go to the location to actually shoot the exterior of the car. And let's say if you're doing a car chase, or you're doing some other like scene involving trucks or things, like any type of vehicle really, and then shooting all that at location, then get your plates, and then bring those plates to the volume and shoot all of your dialogue, things that people have to actually act towards, and normally takes a lot of time whenever you have to reset. Like if you want to shoot like a long scene of dialogue inside of a car, it could go over multiple days. So being able to compress all of that time, be able to reset a whole scene in a click of a button, just helps to simplify a shoot a lot. So that's just another use case of the technology that can help out the production side and just kind of help tighten up schedules. The next one would be essentially trying to design environments where there isn't something that needs to be focused on in the deep background. This is a mess hall environment that we came back to a few times. And really, the only thing that exists here is like the tables that they're sitting on, but the entire backdrop is all the LED volume. And it just allowed them to kind of quickly capture these moments instead of having to worry about storing all of these set pieces, things like that, and just having to pay for all of that. So, it's great to have these more simple environments, but you have to try to design it and write the sequence so that there's nothing happening in the background that all of a sudden the camera needs to rack focus to. Because then normally the wall will kind of fall apart. It'll set the moire. So that's kind of a don't whenever you're trying to look through a script and pick out an environment that would be best shot on a volume. Try to avoid things that have a lot of action in the background that we have to look at. If that does happen, and it does happen in some of the shows that we work on, typically you'd want to bid for that to be replaced in post-production, or at least have a budget set aside for that. The next one would be trying to write scenes where you don't have to look up. As you can see here, you can kind of see the seam between the actual ceiling and the wall itself. And normally we'll do a wide establisher at the beginning of the scene, but then once you're in it, you really don't want to have to look up all that much. Otherwise, you'll be paying for a lot of post cleanup, just trying to clean up the seam up there. One day we're going to have domes. We're going to have dome LEDs, and it's going to be beautiful. We'll be free to do whatever we want. But for now, we have the seam up there, and that's not going away anytime soon. And I believe the next one is, scenes that are long enough. And now shooting, what we're kind of talking about right now is mainly like very intricate 3D real-time environments, which tend to be more expensive. And because of that, we're finding that you have to have at least about like 6 pages of script, or at least that's what we're kind of finding on average, before it starts making sense for an environment to be built to this level of detail and shot on the wall. Anything below 6 pages starts to become territory where it's best to probably do it in VFX. And then if you're going well above 6 pages, like engineering here, where we come back to it a lot, then it totally makes sense to shoot it on the volume. So just taking into consideration the actual screen time that these environments play at. That of course will change if we go into like commercial work where you're using slightly different methods when building these environments. You're going more kind of like a more sophisticated matte painting route. But for these scenes that are actually 3D lit, geometry, lots of real-time reflections, and other like effects elements like particle effects, things like that, you want to stick with a bit of a longer page count when thinking of diving in and using in-camera VFX. And on that note, I think Paulo, hand the mic over to you in terms of the benefits on how production can leverage this tech.
Yeah, thank you. So let's take a moment to talk a little bit about the production value. There's like different key advantages about using in-camera visual effects and LED stages, which is mostly considered as the light. And focusing for a moment like about light, one of the key advantages is basically you can emit natural light with your walls, so that you basically have a very subject, naturally lighting scenario, which you still can complement with traditional lighting, like cineflows and spotlights, depending on like what sort of environment you have. That's one of the beauties, but more focused on that point is kind of like that you have control, and control these days, it's crucial. It's not just about the creativity and the surroundings and all sorts of variables you have, but in this specific case, you're usually, when you do like green screen, blue screen, to accomplish basically the same sort of lighting you have on set or like in real world, if it's approachable, you would do it in post-production, and that takes you a lot of time, and time means a lot of money. And if you're lucky, you get very close to it, but you will never really achieve the actual look and feel, since you're like trying to simulate like the real world, right? So this is one of the great parts about filming actually in LED volumes. But also don't be fooled by just like looking at the volume itself. We got quite often like the question kind of like doing our reviews, which we will talk a little bit later on about, is that things don't look like as they appear. And the reason is basically, I personally compare it like very simplified. If you go to the Best Buy and you watch like different screens and you select your TV, no matter how good the content is graded, it looks on every screen different, right? So imagining you're like in an LED volume, and after everything has been signed off, you're still looking on a stage with a calibrated screens. However, you're adding complexity, which means basically you're adding a camera with different systems, you're adding lenses, which, you know, add an extra look. And then in addition to that, you have a DAT who creates a lot, and then it gets piped through in different screen. And eventually you might like integrate any sort of things like special effects and other additions in the real world. So despite what you sign off and what you might approach with your teams or potential projects, it's always smart to have a camera handy to simulate as close as possible, but you have a good understanding, at least halfway once you start blocking in light and textures, how this actual environment can look like, so that you don't get surprised in the end that things through the camera might look slightly different than in the real world. Other than that, I mean, just looking out right now of my window, and I assume most of you guys are in Toronto, it's raining, it's foggy. Shooting in a volume gives you like a huge control about the weather conditions and the surroundings. So you can imagine shooting yesterday where we had like a blue, clean sky, and now you have to deal with this. It's very difficult because you have to block the shooting days across multiple days. You can't really predict the weather and the conditions, which makes it very challenging and very, very expensive. As Nathan mentioned earlier in Vulcan Restaurant, it also allows you like to hold a complete lighting and mood actually for several hours, which normally you have like, let's say a sunset, a time frame from anywhere from 10 minutes to 30 minutes. So putting that in constraints with cost, you have like a huge cost savings there. And also it goes back to flexibility and centralization. I mean, we talked a little bit about controlling, but on the other hand, working in a volume, it gives you like a lot of flexibility, because depending on how our department and the rest of the teams designing the shooting schedules and the environments, you can, in theory, load up different lighting scenarios during the day. So you can shoot whenever you want to between daytime and nighttime. You can even like jump between different hotspots, which means basically different angles within the world. Or if the set has been built on a very agile, practical way, you could even film on the same day multiple locations within one volume, which reduced the amount of travel and logistics enormously, because you can stay on site. And not to mention, to close this about the lighting, you are actually able like to preserve the lighting and reflections, which is, again, for the production value, essential. But I think more crucial is kind of like thinking about how the actors actually react, having that actually there instead of a green screen and blue screen. And I think the performance, if you have seen it, and now with the upcoming shows being aired, you will see a dramatic change in their performance in a positive way. Speaking of which, like risk mitigations, as I mentioned, it has like a greener footprint. It can be more sustainable because you're reducing the amount of travel. As much as we all love to travel to Paris, New York, and Sydney, but considering also kind of like it gives us more like a comfort to build up a team and being in the same location, you know, rather than just jumping around through the different neighborhoods during the week, or even like through various cities across the months. So you can centralize it. And also it allows you basically to leverage the technique to build up a closer collaboration across the departments. Some other benefits about using this technique is, to give you some examples, it's also kind of like when you deal with minors, like with kids. As some of you know, or have maybe like filmed with kids, you have other restrictions. You can't shoot all day long. And normally if you're in set, you have to bring them from A to B. You lose a lot of time. having them on location, it reduces it significantly. So you can film way more content because it's just like basically the way between makeup and getting to the stage. And that applies obviously like to the entire cast, which is wonderful. Another scenario is kind of like that you can amortize, and this goes a little bit back to what Nathan mentioned, the amount of environment. So as more content you can create and tell, or as bigger the world is, and you can use that to explore it and basically create a journey in your storytelling, that reduces the cost significantly. And the goal is, even we're right now not in a world where it's fully established, to have actually an end-to-end pipeline, which was originally promised by introducing previs to the directors, but now we're coming in a world where actually we are getting very close to this promise to create assets as a prototype, and as you go, creating those worlds that they can be used in post-production as well. Yeah, and to close this risk mitigation and financial part, I would say from our experience right now, you're like somewhere in an 80-20 ratio, where those shots are actually filmed successfully in camera, which means kind of like you might want to consider, if you plan it the right way, a little bit of budget and time to do wire removals, to do like some cleanups, as Nathan mentioned. Kind of like sometimes if you shoot an establisher, you might go into the ceiling, but you have a little bit budget like about replacing backgrounds. Again, the cost can be reduced by planning those things in advance. So planning is key as usual, but even more in using virtual production and in-camera visual effects. And then you might end up like paying another 20-30% for any sort of like full CG establishers of things you cannot accomplish on a volume these days. And one of the beautiful parts, again, is not only the relocations and setting up the teams. You have to consider, like, after you're done with the production, the teams normally separate. They're like already in other locations. If you have to do pickups, which we could use as well the volume for, it allows you like a huge headache. Normally you have to check with the location if it's still availability. You have to pay additional licensing, tax credits, etc., just to name a few things. But speaking about cost savings, I'm a personal, I would say, like a little bit hesitant about like using visual production just for the matter like that you can, or hypothetically can, save money. It's not always about cost savings. Sometimes you might be able like to use this technology as well to help other departments because of the lack of time or lack of resources. If you don't have enough carpenters to actually create the physical set, you might be able to compensate that with virtual production. Last but not least, it comes down to leverage the potential for virtual production and storytelling and visualization. I think that shouldn't have a real price tag. And one more crucial part, which I already mentioned, is like planning. And the reason why I put it on planning, because again, it's not visual effects, it's visual production. It's crucial, and not just to cut corners down here, because otherwise you end up an empty stage. So unlikely in comparison to visual effects, where you might be able like to extend the deadline, a no-show malfunctioning stage could make your show basically fail. And this is like a zero tolerance for mistake situation. So this is, you can't afford that as a company, not as a vendor, not as a studio. So planning is really key. And but before we go too dramatic, let's go a couple of steps back and break down how such a scenario can be avoided. And the saying it, namely kicking off virtual production adventure the right way. So back to Nathan.
Sweet. So yeah, it always, before we start creating any environment, it'll tend to start with a kickoff with the art department and the production designer. So we've kind of like isolated 3 different ways that we can start building an environment. The first one, which is as you see here, the top image is the kind of like a blueprint, a very detailed blueprint and 3D model that the art department actually provides to us. And then on the bottom portion, you kind of see the final lit result. And you see a big difference there, mainly because when our department is focusing on the design of the space, they really want to be able to showcase all of the details and all of the qualities that need to be seen in the final product. And then once we've brought that in, and then we start pulling in like directors and DPs and start getting their feedback, the overall lighting and the feel of the space slowly changes until we all agree like this is what the final look is going to be. So the first approach is getting a detailed 3D model from art department, and then we kind of just take it from there and start organizing calls and reviews to get feedback from all creative parties. The second way that we found is a bit more of a discovery, where there'll be a general idea from the production designer of what they're looking for. And then we can kind of take that away and start spitballing different ideas on, how can we help design this space and take full advantage of the tech. And the common ice chamber, which is what you're seeing here, is a great example of that, where we kind of introduce this glowing hieroglyphic patterns across the back wall, which originally wasn't going to be there. And it kind of plays into the whole sequence as they're unlocking this egg-like device in the middle of the room. So that's kind of the second approach. And then the third approach is us kind of doing the groundwork like completely on our end. So just presenting a piece of concept art back to production, and then having them give their notes, and essentially skipping over the step of waiting for an approved material from our department and having us provide it to them from the ground up. So that's just an example there, a third example. And then other bits of information that we need to know before we can really start working on an environment is the actual LED volume itself. Now, luckily enough, in our situation, we own our own volumes and we have access to them, and they're the same volumes that we're shooting on. So we know that, but there in some instances where we're shooting on other people's volumes, and it's crucial to know the actual shape, the diameter, before you start building, because that plays directly into the design of the virtual set and how that handoff between practical and the virtual is going to be treated. Normally we'll have a scan of the volume, and that will be present at all times in our Unreal scene as we're building, just so it's like an overhanging presence, and we're always aware of where that edge is going to be at all times. And then the next thing that we kind of need to know right off the bat is the lighting scenarios. So the engineering room, I think that's what we're looking at, yeah. The engineering room is I think we had like 4 different lighting scenarios, and they kind of evolved over the course of many months. And I think at one point in time, there was like 3 different DPs, all with their own like unique lighting look, contributing to this asset. So yeah, we just need to know all of the lighting scenarios and lighting cues going in before we start building an environment. And then lastly would be like DMX controlled and animation cues. And no, we don't mean that DMX. DMX is kind of like the standard. If you don't know, it's kind of like MIDI. It's like a standard protocol for controlling light sources and other pieces of machinery on set. And we can leverage that and use those channels and signals directly inside our environment. So this was the cargo hold peregrine, which we just saw the concept art for, but we're able to trigger sparks, lighting flashes, things like that, and be able to have both the practical set have the lights flash on the practical set, and then control with the same signal that's going to the practical set, control the virtual set as well. So that type of integration is like, it's super crucial to kind of make the blend work between both the practical and virtual spaces. So yeah, once we have a clear idea of everything that needs to be actually seen in the final product, we start to structure our VAD team or our virtual art department. And that's what Paulo is going to start talking about now.
Yeah, so after completing the first season by using in-camera visual effects on Stranger Worlds and Discovery, we learned that there's like a lot of potential like to streamline this process, starting by refining the terminology, but also like strengthening like the blend between the practical and digital world. And also kind of like in addition to the ambition of pushing creative visions further with the next season, we mostly looked into ways to operate cost efficient. One of them was kind of like trying to avoid to rebuild models as we showed earlier receiving from the art department, since they use CAD data like actually to design and build those physical props, but also not to be involved late. So this is like one thing you want to consider, and actually I would consider this a don't, to be involved too late, because otherwise you won't be able like to be part of expanding this beauty of building those unique worlds and help the screenwriters and production designers to take full advantage of this technique. The reason behind of that is kind of like most of them, or I would say as per today, I'm quite confident to say that most of the people know what an LED volume is. However, people don't know yet what are the limitations or how can we work around. Can it be only used as a wallpaper, as a still? Is it really real time? And this is kind of like where the VAT department, also like virtual art department, also called as VAT, comes in place to tag team with the art department while the screenwriters are still developing the scripts and help to contribute to understand how this technology can help them like to shape their stories and to push them into the next level. So basically, in short, virtual art department builds the bridge between the traditional art department and the use of in-camera visual effects. So that can step in to help through the concept over to rapid prototyping and asset builds, which can be carried over to the final pixel, so which we define for the actual shooting, but also to the post and provide key art, which can be used as a guideline across all the different departments. So literally handing a piece of guideline out to all the departments way before they shoot. So everyone has a clear understanding how the costumes need to look, how the set is going to look. And this is not just a rough abstract concept. This is like as close as can be seen for the camera simulated through the, in our case, Unreal Engine. But in order like to get those things accomplished, it's really crucial like to have a clear team structure and defined roles. And these days, while virtual production and VAD are still establishing a common language, the core team should be at least based out of an art director, a visual effects / virtual production supervisor, and a producer who oversees the project from the beginning to the really end, to post-production, basically. And ideally, it should be followed by a VAD supervisor who is in charge and has the full ownership of an individual environment. And then underneath that position, you may have like concept artists, journalists, and look dev artists, so all under the umbrella of virtual art department, which could be complemented by traditional visual effects related department for the actual realization. That could be anything from animation, CG effects, and DMP, which pipes back into virtual art department to finalize those environments after the concept has been signed off. That said, virtual art department can also be helping like to block storylines and lighting scenarios. So that goes a little bit back to what Nathan said. Since we have the technology for real-time visualization, it allows us like to bring in all the departments at the very early stage, where previous back in the time was a tool made for the directors, while other parties like the production designers and cinematographers were like excluded. So they had like not really an idea or understanding where the journey would go. With virtual production in this case, you're really able like to use previs, TechVis, and the virtual art department, allowing all parties to be involved and build a closer collaboration. it's still like a challenge to find talents. So this is kind of like something you don't want to underestimate. Luckily, we get like more and more out there across partners. Epic has a fellowship. Pixelmondo has its own virtual production academy, which allows you like to understand more of the technology on the creative side and executional way. So yeah, research is still a challenge these days, and it won't be solved immediately. But it's crucial, kind of like that we have a community like yours to work together and increase the understanding about using virtual production in the first place. And speaking about the lack of resources brings me actually to my next point, is think outside the box. The beauty of virtual production, in particular in-camera visual effects, I would say it pushes us all back to the days where we decided to join the film industry, actually creating movies. You know, everyone had a different approach. I come originally from animation, and the interesting part is like there's like no limitations. And today, the crucial enemies we have to face are resources and time. And when I say resources and time, it's mostly there's a lack of resources mentioned, but also the time. Because you're shifting all this post-production process to the front, and it's still like a huge learning curve for all the different departments, especially in the studio side. And it helps you like to overcome some roadblockers. So not to get into detail where you lose time, just imagine that you're like in the pre-production about creating those environments, and you need to make up for time. I mean, we all know it from visual effects. So sadly, with production, or not as a surprise, it's pretty much the same issue. And to give you some ideas, thinking out of the box and coming back to the point about filmmaking is use all your knowledge you have from traditional filmmaking over using machine learning, AI, anything you can imagine and dream of, and give it a shot, being experimental and a visionary. So to give you a quick example, what we did on Valeo Beta, while we were waiting to free up some resources, we decided to go with a miniature build, which was built traditionally as you would do it for any other movie. We did then a scanning of the set and enhance it for the actual environment, but also for a later planned establisher for visual effects. So this is the final result in camera. So this is kind of like what was actually shot at the wall through the camera and finally used with no touch-ups. And in this example as well, you can see we use it like for being outside as well as in the cargo hold to show outside. So by building this miniature build, we actually like, I think kind of like you killed two birds with one stone. So considering like the short amount of time frames we sometimes have, it's a huge help by using this technique. Again, it wasn't perfect, but you know, it helps you because otherwise you would just lose time until you wait for your resources, and also figuring out the methodology. In addition, like we use it for visual effects. So again, coming back to killing two birds with one stone, anything kind of like you use outside of the box can be used in several ways. Another quick example is T-Prink's apartment, also from Strange New Worlds Season 1. It's basically where we had to create a world where Spock is standing on a corner on the edge of a penthouse, looking down and looking kind of like into this beautiful world surrounded by a sand sea. And as much we try like to accomplish it on the wall, we defined like a workflow about having like a hybrid solution for that. So that said, we defined it by putting blue screen on the ground, moving up, filming into the wall, which keeps the environment we have built for this particular environment, and enhance it later with traditional post-production. So again, what we used here, as you can see, is not only CG effects, but also we looked into other ways by using liquids. In this case, we used floating sand as elements to drive and create this extra level of finessing of the sand sea. And again, Stranger Worlds in this case allows us a little bit like of an abstract world, but the reason why we show that is those things take normally a lot of time to get it accomplished in the traditional way. And even if you would be able like to accomplish it in a traditional way, the wall probably wouldn't perform. So when you create those contents on the screen, it's one thing, but if you want to play back those things either as a playback or as a simulation on such a volume, it's probably not going to work out in your favor. And to finalize, it comes all down to collaboration, which in-camera visual effects allows you to strengthen the partnership with art department, production designers, and cinematographers, and also to guide and consult in the timeline. So you have to keep in mind how you're going to build those environments and advise when certain milestones can be achieved. Because it's still a different world, and you want to make sure that all the parties are speaking the same language, and also kind of like to allow that everyone, including the DPs, have enough time from the very early beginning to familiarize themselves with this environment. And again, in-camera visual effects allows you that because it's interactive, it's in real time, and it allows it to go way, way faster. That said, I don't want to cut anything off from Nathan because it goes into the creative point and how you can iterate and communicate way faster with your clients. I'm just handing over back to Nathan, who's going to talk about feedback loops and fast iterations.
Great. Yeah. So yeah, this process ends up being like way more parallel than visual effects. Normally in visual effects, and what you're seeing here is like a time lapse of some of our client calls where we're getting feedback from everyone. Yeah, like in VFX, it tends to be way more linear, where you'll have like your concept art team working on a frame, and then you'll go and you'll shoot elements, and then you'll bring that back into the studio. Then you'll go through match moves, you'll go through layout, you'll go through animation, effects, lighting, comp, like all of that. Where when we're finding that when we're building these worlds, and it's quite hard to wrangle, but you're doing almost everything all at once. You're adjusting the layout, you're adjusting lighting, you're adjusting textures of surfaces, all at once. And it's something that we're still trying to find the best way to handle. And you're just getting a massive amount of input of notes from left, right, and center. Like normally we'd just be working with a VFX soup, like a client-side VFX soup. But in this case, you're in a room of 30 people, and they're all voicing their own opinions, and we all have to pull all those notes together, and in the next review, show actual progress on them. So it's actually a fun challenge. It was a welcomed change. So normally in the early days, we'd start with just doing layout, similar to what you just saw in the previous video. If you go back to that one, Paulo, there's like this kind of like gray shaded looking terrain. So we start with that. We get our key light down. We usually have the DP involved with who's eventually going to be shooting it there present. And then we'll find our general key light direction. We'll play around with different levels of atmosphere, and then we'll move into a stage review. So this was something that we actually didn't do an awful lot on the first season, but we ended up doing it a lot more on season 2, which is we'll do 2 remote reviews with Unreal Engine over Zoom, and then we'll go to the stage and actually review it at scale, because we found the main note that we would get over and over again was things look like they're in completely different locations, or they're like completely different scales from what we had imagined. So going to the volume is incredibly important. And then while we're kind of solidifying the general layout of the terrain, our asset department is already starting to build the higher resolution versions of everything. And then as those high resolution assets start to become available, we'll be pulling them into the engine, updating them throughout the entire process. And then we'll have more lighting centric meetings where as those high resolution assets get populated, we having to make lighting adjustments because now their surfaces start to react to light slightly differently. And then usually once our lighting starts to get very close to final, like everyone's pretty confident with it, then we'll do a key art. So we'll start doing paint overs in Photoshop. We'll render off like a few angles, and those are angles that are actually capable of being shot in the volume. And then we'll do paint overs and get everyone to sign off on the final look. And then once those key art frames are approved, then we move into our final build, which is final optimization, and making sure that when we load it up on the volume that's going to be performant, it's going to be running at 24 frames per second. Because we're not just rendering one perspective, we have to optimize it so that we're able to run it on like 3 cameras, essentially. So you have like your background wallpaper, and then you have your A cam and your B cam. So you have to optimize the scene quite heavily to actually be able to shoot with that many cameras. Something that you don't think about when building like a video game. And then once we have the final actual asset, normally we'd have like a 2-day technical blocker before a shoot, and that shoot that gives us time to do that final optimization stage and make sure that our integration with the lighting board operator is all working and ready and it's battle tested. And then we'll do a blend day, and a blend day is a magical day where we finally get to see the practical set and the virtual set together finally at last, after months and months and months of talking. So normally we'd have a scan of the practical set, and then we bring that scan into Unreal, and then we'll line up our virtual set to that. So the day starts with just alignment, and then we'd move into looking at the concept, like the key art frames that have been approved, and trying to match that look through the camera to the key art frame, just looking at the backdrop. So just looking at the virtual space, ignoring the actual practical space. And once we find that our entire backdrop is matching to the key art frame, then we'd start introducing overhead light sources to light the practical set, and lighting the practical set to a point where the seam between the practical and virtual space starts to become less and less noticeable. So you're doing as much as you can to try to make that invisible. And then the last stage would be to go in and start doing these color corrects, which are, they call them CCRs, or color correct regions, which are these small volumetric containers. You can pick different shapes, and everything within them gets a color correct applied to it, and you can adjust it just like you would in a grading software. So you go in and you start making fine-tune adjustments to everything, and then once that's said and done, and everyone's happy, then we're ready for a shoot. And normally on a shoot day, if a blend day goes well, there shouldn't be any hiccups. It should run smoothly, and a shoot day should be the least amount of work for us. Like 90% of the work should happen on the blend day, and then on the shoot day, it's just small little adjustments here and there. Every once in a while, there'll be like some new shot that we want to try out, or some new angle that we never discussed, or things like that, and they'll pop up, and of course that's going to happen. But yeah, shoot days should be the quietest day for the VAD team. Yeah, so I think with that being said, now we got final shots in camera, and everyone's happy and it looked great in the edit. We have our final product, and I think now we're just gonna transition over into Q&As, Paulo, unless you have anything else.
No, I think you nailed it, and it's really important, like, just to stress it out, like, again, the importance, and what you don't want to do is like to compare it with visual effects, because in the end, it comes down to that if you accept the challenge about either creating such a world or you operate a stage or both, or being on the studio side and doing that, keeping in mind that with a black screen, you can film, right? And there's like no way back. Like there's this point of no return, and this is so crucial, like to understand setting those milestones, setting the expectations, and align the language with the different departments, and not just speaking visual effects lingo. More trying to understand their language, because it's easier probably for you or for us to speak traditional film language rather than explaining several departments of visual effects lingo. That said, before we jump into the FAQs, I want to use this opportunity, if you got a little bit of excitement here, we're looking for people in Toronto and across the globe. So this is a great moment to take a quick screenshot if you want to, and reach out to us. In general speaking, also, if you have questions after the session, don't hesitate to contact either Nathan or myself. And that said, we have a little bit of an eye candy while we jump into the FAQ. So we will play back some more in-camera shots while we answer your questions. So thank you very much.
ICVFX. I'm jumping into the questions. You had mentioned in your presentation the inspiration for conjuring up those background designs and ideas for a project. What are some of the challenges that people need to be aware of when designing for ICVFX?
I think there's a lot of changes happening. I mean, Unreal Engine changes so rapidly. It's one of the fastest evolving pieces of software that I've had to deal with, and it's been a bit of a pain. But at the beginning, we were very worried about vertex weight, like just like how high resolution all of our models were. And that problem is starting to go away now with Nanite. Things like we were also like very worried about lighting changes and lighting cues, and having to go from like one lighting scenario to another. Like they wanted to go in engineering room, they wanted to go to a more white, stark, lit environment, going into red alert in one shot. And at that point in time, like 2 years ago, that wasn't possible. Like we couldn't blend different lighting bakes together. So we had to write around that, where they go out into the hallway, we then go into red alert, and then come back. So, but now we haven't been able to confirm this, but in Unreal Engine 5.1, the word on the street is that potentially Lumen will actually work on these volumes. It works in games, but it currently doesn't work on volumes. So we're hoping that the lighting limitations start going away. So right now we're finding that we have to be careful with is like animation. So trying but it's something that we're pushing for, like getting more movement in the background, but doing like very dense photorealistic crowds is challenging, especially if they're very close to the volume. So trying to stay away from that. And then just very big moving objects in the background can also be problematic, mainly because like once you get to the editing room floor, it becomes a continuity nightmare, because you'll be cutting shots together, and then you'll have these things that are there and then they're not there. And that's why they're kind of best to be left in post-production. But if you're doing, like, let's say 2 kilometers away, there's a fleet of small cars that are like a constant stream of them that are flying through the sky, and that's something that is totally doable. So just keeping in mind continuity issues, and then trying to limit the amount of large animated objects. those are kind of the our big flags right now, and things like glass. Like glass has always been tough. Like getting photorealistic looking refraction in glass is still tough in real time. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
Mm-hmm. I noticed the volume isn't entirely 360 degrees around. What is the degree of frustum that you need to design the environments to? Or do you find that you need to develop a whole 360 environment in order to be successful in planning for this?
Yeah, it becomes a sound issue at that point because you're getting locked in as an echo chamber. So you just if you build a closed off volume, it just like you pretty much have to redo all of your dialogue afterwards.
Okay.
You're starting to design panels that actually absorb sound, but currently with the ones that we have they're not really designed for how we're using them. There will be a whole new series of panels coming out for it. And there are in some cases like plugs, like they'll build a large wall that just kind of like gets wheeled in and locks everyone inside. But then you have like a seam issue as well. Like you want to essentially build a seamless structure, and then any type of doorway ends up being something that just won't be clean. Like you'll just see a faint line down it. But the designs for these stages are also like rapidly changing as well. And you could, in theory, design a practical element or something in the set that hides that line, right? But at least from the test that one of our head of VP, the Josh, he just said like any of the full circular volumes he's been in has just been an audio nightmare. It just echoes like mad.
Where do you find that you have to draw the line between what you have on the stage in the volume versus what you have to do in post-production? You were talking about having to add larger characters and stuff like that. What is the advantage of having it there live versus having to add it in post?
Like a digital character, having it there live.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the advantage of having it there live would be that you're done. Like whatever you see is what you get. But again, like especially a character that's like a key point, you probably want to focus on it, and then I'd probably recommend just having to do that in post anyways. I mean, it's still handy, and I think we did this on House of Dragons. Was that like there was dragons on the wall that were just there for eye lines. So it's still, even if it's planned to be replaced in post, having something there for the actors to look at, and even just for people to frame up shots, is still hugely useful. Yeah, and yeah, but like fully realistic digital characters on the volume right now is still pretty challenging, and I'd leave that for post production.
Absolutely. You mentioned continuity in terms of shooting in a small space like a car, and the continuity and reflections allowing for tightening production and cleaner deadlines. Do you find, or how do you find the cost comparison between having physical assets and the storage and maintenance of those assets compared to recreating everything digitally in CG?
It's a very interesting point. Like we're looking right now into analyzing the metrics, because it really depends about like how much you're filming. And episodic, it allows you like to go eventually back to those environments over and over again. So if you just planning to have a one-off, there's no real like cost savings. Again, just like take that with a grain of salt. However, when you decide, for instance, we have this beautiful engineering room and it's being used in several instances with different looks and feels, that reduced like the cost significantly. So I can't give you like a number at this point, as we're looking into also like the percentage, but we estimated that there's like a huge saving part, and it comes down like into the initial planning where art department and visual art department are working closely with the screenwriters to define how this world is going to look like. So it's more detail you include and sorry, more time and detail you invest in your planning phase. That's going to allow you to reduce all those elements and costs.
Yeah, and just to touch on the whole car driving thing, I mean, you're not only trying to save costs in VFX, like you're also saving production costs of like trying to take what would normally take 4 days and shrink it down to 1. I mean there's a whole. It's so easy to just say what does this save in VFX, but it's much more complex than that.
Your presentation was titled The Do's and Don'ts of ICVFX, and Nathan, you and I had talked before about the purpose of this presentation. You guys wanted to share with people so that they knew what the mistakes were and what the positive points were. Can you share what some of the biggest mistakes people who are new to virtual production make and how they can avoid making those mistakes?
I can do 3, and Paul, you want to do 3?
Yeah.
Paul, you go.
Okay, I start with 2, and then I'll leave the third one after you. So first of all, don't underestimate the time you require to build those environments. This technology is not made in the first place for films. It's still a game engine. It's a completely different process, not established as visual effects, which exists for over 20 or 30 years. So again, it's hard to say how long things take because it's very individual, similar to visual effects, but even more complex in this scenario because you're working with so many more departments. There's like so many more moving elements you have to consider and change as you go. So yeah, don't communicate any sort of weeks unless you have experienced the actual build. So be very careful about that. The second part is goes back into technology. There's like great like things kind of like as Nate mentioned, like with the updates of Unreal and other engines and other technologies out there. But it's similar to visual effects. You're not like changing a full pipeline while you work on a project. And in addition to that, again, coming back to the risk assessment is you don't want to take additional risk about making this entire project fail when you film. And we experience quite often that, let's say, Unreal announced or released a new function, which might work in the demo case for them or even in a game. And even if we implement it, it might work twice of 10 times. And this is a risk no one can take on, right? Just because it's there, it doesn't mean that it's working on the volume. So this is definitely like a don't. So don't listen to the releases of every version. Trust your partners in what's doable and what's not doable.
I'm trying to think back on the biggest issues that we've had. I think probably the shoots that didn't go as smoothly were the ones that had a lot of last minute changes. Like we had spent 4 months all agreeing on a look to something, and everyone having their moment to be able to chime in and make changes. And then like a day or two beforehand, there's a giant like, oh no, we want to move the light source over here now, or we want to change the whole scale or position of things, or there's too many of these types of assets. And there's a lot of positive like viral media out there on Unreal Engine and being very able to adapt and be able to change things in real time very, very quickly. But when it comes to performance, and being able to actually run something at 24 frames per second on something this large, right now with the current state of tech, like things can't change drastically a day before a shoot. It just becomes a nightmare, and everyone should all of the lead creatives need to be involved months beforehand and be able to actually look at things and sign off on them and feel like they're already familiar with it before they step on to set. So that would be my number one. And then a number two would be doing very regular reviews of your material or the environment that you're building on the volume as often as you're able to, because the color the color representation on the panels right now, like it'll vary quite drastically from your computer monitor. They, at least like the pro ones, like they tend to spike in the red channel. So like environments that are very red are problematic on the volume. There's just not a lot of color range there. And yeah, so and just like the scale and the feeling of the position of everything changes so drastically. So just trying to get everyone to actually see their work, even the artists who are working on it, being able to see it on the wall. It's the same thing with like VFX daily sessions when we'd all pile into the room and watch our work on the projector. It's like you're looking at it under a microscope at that point. And it's something that I miss working remotely. But there's a reason why we had done that, and these volumes are 10 times bigger than that projector that we were watching shots on. So yeah, you got to get there, because like it just, things that we would be pointing out in our review sessions, remote review sessions, which aren't as obvious, end up becoming extremely obvious when you're there on the LED wall. So those would be my two biggest things.
You mentioned using Unreal Engine and the updates and whatnot that you have to deal with. What kind of tech stack do you guys use at Pixamundo to work within the technology in addition to Unreal?
Like what other DCCs that we using?
What other softwares do you guys use in order to accomplish Final Look?
Yeah, I mean, for assets, it's similar to VFX. I mean, for different types of terrain, I mean, in our case, we're mainly talking about environments. So like terrain, we've experimented with building terrain in Gaia, building terrain in Houdini, and exporting height fields, bringing them into Unreal. We've also experimented with like the procedural ways of just generating terrain inside of Unreal itself. And then for the actual like props and assets themselves, it's fairly similar to VFX, where whatever the artist is comfortable, like whatever instrument they can play best, would like just to let them use it. So whether or not that's Blender, whether or not that's Maya, whatever modeling package like ZBrush, whatever they would like to use. And for texturing, we definitely try to lean on Substance for texturing, just going a bit more of the procedural route. And it also has a nice bridge with Unreal Engine and has a plugin for it that you can do really quick look development directly inside of Unreal, which is really handy for the earlier stages. And then on a lighting front, like we will sometimes do our lighting, especially for deep background and midground. We do lighting sometimes in Arnold or Redshift or some other offline render engine, and then bringing those renders into Unreal and using them kind of like as matte paintings in the same 2.5D approach that you would do inside of Nuke. Yeah, so it really is a giant soup, and you're kind of like figuring out, letting everyone do and use a software that they're comfortable in and most proficient in, and then figuring out a way is like, all right, well, how do we get this into Unreal? How do we how do we figure out how to get it in and work in real time? We don't want to like handcuff artists and be like, no, you have to work a particular way. And we also like encourage people to suggest different workflows and suggest new software on a very regular basis and try to work it in any way we can.
What are some key recommendations you have for writers and directors regarding working on an ICVFX shoot?
Get us in as soon as possible. I don't know, Paula, if you want to grab this one.
Yeah, like being with them like on board from the get-go. I think that defines it like the easiest way, because again, it's kind of like it goes in two ways, right? Like one is the creative part, like what can you do with this technology? What's your actual vision? Because a lot of people start blocking themselves about writing out ideas because they're like, oh, we're going to use this technology, we're not familiar with it. There's like so many limitations that might hurt, but it's not their expertise, and I wouldn't expect from them like understanding every bits and pieces. And our job is like, even if things are not possible, to make them possible, right? So that's number one. The other part is also advise kind of like where this technology makes more sense, so that they can rewrite certain passages or scenes to create more dialogue, to have more coverage. Also, if it's considered as not as a limited series, maybe as a traditional multi-episodic format to reuse those worlds. It can go in so many different directions. So putting in a one sentence is, get us involved from day one as a partner. And the other part is probably like what Nathan already pointed out, is like the reviews. I think those are crucial to have specific key people being part during the process, not every single day, but at those milestones, to actually feel and see those elements. And we had a huge success with people who have even been hesitant after coming to the volume, seeing gradiated things, to feel the dimensions and making changes, because it has a huge impact, not just for us and the art department building the physical set, but also how the directors and the DPs are actually envisioning this world. We tried things out with virtual reality, where you have an Oculus or similar systems on your face. But again, this is not the reality. This is not like when you actually operate in the volume.
And I think even just having like writing meetings with either the VAD just there, even if we're just like a fly on the wall, like, because I feel like sometimes there's this hesitance to write certain things in because they're just worried that the technology can't actually support it. But there probably is a way to bring it in if it's far back enough, or you could pre-render a lot of things and just have them as like playable media. It doesn't have to be 3D assets, if they're set back far enough. So I think that there's a way to make almost any idea work if it's caught far enough ahead of time. So yeah, I think bringing those two departments together, because like we know pretty much anything can be done in visual effects if you have the money, but doing it in real time, just having both of those teams together, I think we'd be able to spitball ideas back and forth. Like the writing team could be, oh, we have an idea to do this, and we're like, okay, well, we can't do it exactly that way, but we could do something very similar. So yeah, having those teams together would be amazing.
And speaking quickly about the money, since we have demonstrated mostly a high profile show with a different budget. So the beauty now is as well, LED volumes became more affordable. And I truly believe it's kind of a lot of ways, kind of how even indie filmmaker can use this. And this comes down again, to script writing, to understand you don't always need a full volume. You can work out a very modular way for playback and driving shoot plates. But also kind of if you're building a traditional set piece where you have backdrops. So instead of using the full volume, you can have small pieces. We even saw scenarios for really low budget movies where they actually used LED TVs to block out angles for a specific window, which saved them a lot of time and money instead of using a green screen and replacing everything in post. So just because right now we present those things on a larger stage, and more things are coming out. Please don't underestimate that you can use it also like for smaller budgets if you do it the right way.
Thank you both so much for taking us very deep in depth of the do's and don'ts of ICVFX. We have run out of time at this point, but I'm sure people would love to get in touch with you through the contact information that you had posted above. I hope you all screenshotted that. And I just wanted to say thank you both for joining us. I really learned a lot myself about the whole process of ICVFX, and I really hope that our audience was listening. So thank you both, Paolo and Nathan, for a wonderful chat.